when we started the company, we actually were a hardware and software solution. So we had two hardware devices that would help accomplish this goal that we wanted in terms of protecting critical infrastructure. After we got the prototypes put together in early 2020, everybody probably knows what happened then with the pandemic. It became clear that people did not want a hardware solution. They wanted to be able to get remote access to their devices. They wanted to be able to load software on any commodity platform. They wanted to have the flexibility to load that in virtual machines, Kubernetes clusters, containers, etc.
Hey guys, welcome to the Grow IT podcast. Your host here, Alessandro Cutri, joined none other than today by Tom Sego, one of the CEOs, the CEO over at Blastwave. He has quite the extensive background that I'm excited to dive into and hear a little bit about his story and what they're currently building. But without further ado, I'll just go ahead and pass it on over to you, Tom, if you don't mind, introducing yourself and just telling, the audience a little bit about your story and how you got to where you are today.
Sure. Yeah, well, thanks for the opportunity. I'm Tom Sego, like you said. I'm the co-founder, CEO of Blastwave, and this is my fourth startup. But before I got into doing startups, I spent a decade working at factories. So I worked at Caterpillar for a little bit, and then Eli Lilly doing pharmaceutical manufacturing for 8 years. I went to business school, and then I worked for a small company called Alta Vista, and which was at the time was doing more search queries than Google. I also worked at Emerson Electric for a short period of time, and then I went and spent a decade at Apple,
Wow.
where I eventually got promoted to run worldwide sales support. So I did that up until 2010, and then I started my first company, knowing that I don't know jack squat about starting companies. I coupled myself to someone who'd been doing it for their entire career and was just kind of almost like an apprenticeship.
Mhm.
And we co-founded this company and ended up having a successful exit. And then I started two more after that. One was a solar storage company. Another was wine importing business. And then I also played some professional poker
Huh.
for about 3 years before I started Blastwave. And the reason I started Blastwave is after working in factories for a decade and learning about technology,
Uh-huh.
I realized that it was inevitable that more and more of our critical infrastructure was going to get connected.
Yeah.
And when it gets connected, there's a path for harm.
Hmm.
And when you looked at the solutions out there, there really wasn't anything that could address this issue because you might have devices that are 30 to 50 years.
Yeah.
You can't load any software on them.
Yeah.
And there's no patch Tuesday in factories. So we came up with an approach to try to protect this critical infrastructure. And this was before we started having some of these big high profile incidents like the Colonial Pipeline.
Wow. Interesting stuff, man. It seems like you've done a lot of different things and you've had some side quests here and there, right? From some of
Yeah.
your background. I'm curious though, what was it that you obviously you had your stint at Apple, right? And then after that, you're like, okay, I want to start a company. What was it that, clicked in your head or even motivated you to want to go down that path, right? And to do something yourself?
Well, I think it was a realization more than anything else
Hmm.
that I am hardwired as an entrepreneur.
Hmm.
And by that I mean I'm not afraid of looking stupid.
Yeah.
I'm not afraid of taking risks.
Hmm.
I'm not afraid of making mistakes. And that's absolutely essential if you're going to be an entrepreneur. And I also thought my entire career, I had been doing entrepreneurial things or attempting to within these large corporate structures.
Yeah.
Like when I was at Apple, for example, I started out running worldwide promotions. And then after I got promoted to worldwide sales support, I only had five groups. But there was one, for example, situation where I was sitting in a meeting in Europe with the quarterly sales review, and Tim Cook, who was my boss, he was analyzing what their performance is going to be, and they were talking about this Apple Premium Reseller Program. And I turned to him, I said, "So why aren't we doing this everywhere?" And he's like, "We should."
Mhm.
And so I'm like, "All right, let's make it happen." So at that point, I took on the role of
Yeah.
growing this program worldwide from a Europe kind of foothold.
Huh.
And so like that was an example of me kind of, and that we went from 300 stores to 2,600 stores in about 3 years.
Wow.
It's huge growth.
Wow.
Very humbling, lots of missteps,
Yeah.
lots of
What
lessons.
was like the thing that you maybe learned the most out of that experience? Like, what was that, from, that expansive growth? What was that, I'm sure there's a couple things, but
Yeah,
if
I
you
would
had,
say the first thing that I learned was make sure you get the right leader.
hmm,
And what I did was I negotiated to take the guy who had started the program in Europe.
hmm,
I said, I want to take him in my team and have him run that worldwide.
hmm,
So that was really critical, in fact, I think, for the success because he'd already done it
yeah,
in Europe. He knew exactly where all the pitfalls were.
hmm,
I think the second thing that was important, at least in a corporate setting, was having the support of the leadership team that
yeah,
this is an important initiative that's going to allow you to get resources. And if you can't get resources within an internal skunkworks project, you're not going to be successful. And
yeah,
so having that kind of being granted the holy water was also really important. And then the third thing was understanding what I don't know
hmm,
and being able to ask questions about the things that I don't know so that I could be useful as opposed to just, figurehead.
yeah. And I think that's an important quality of even the last one that you mentioned, especially in any entrepreneur that I see that's performed very well is like the ability to be humble enough, right, to know that there's always more to learn, right, and there's always someone that you can learn it from, rather than thinking that you know best in every single scenario, right? And I
Absolutely.
feel like as entrepreneurs, sometimes we can get caught up in the mindset of like, oh, I can do this better than this person, or I could do this, I could do this myself because we're self-starter people. But
Yep.
having that, humility to be like, wait a second, there's people out there that know this way better than I do. Let me like learn from them so that I can accelerate my growth. I think that's, so important.
And I think it's also especially important if you're a technical founder, because if you're a technical founder, you actually are going to be the expert or one of the experts in this field. And so that it's going to be more challenging for them to kind of maintain that humility when they frankly do know a lot. They might actually be the smartest person in the room.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a great point as well. That's a great point as well. I did want to fast forward just a little bit, right? Because we talked about your experience, and then now current day, you're obviously running the operations, and you're the CEO over at Blastwave. For the audience that's tuning in that doesn't know a lot about Blastwave, I know you talked a little bit about it earlier.
Mhm.
Would you mind just diving into the value proposition and kind of what you guys maybe separates you from other cybersecurity companies out there?
Yeah. I would say first and foremost, we are all about protection,
Mm.
not detecting things, monitoring traffic,
Hmm.
sending alerts that people can process. It's really about prevention.
Mm.
And that's a very difficult field because you have to prove a negative.
Mm.
To be a preventative company, you have to at least give social proof that bad events aren't happening and you're stopping them from happening. So that's a big challenge in
Yeah.
our field.
Yeah.
But I would say that we've positioned ourselves somewhat uniquely because my decade at Apple taught me some very important lessons about product development, product management. And
Hmm.
one of them was if you can take something that's very complex and you can make it simple, which is very hard, but if you can do that, especially in an area like cybersecurity where you really don't want your customer to have to come up to speed on all the nuances of cryptographic communication and all the different networking concepts, routing. If you can make it simple, that's going to make it also more secure. Because if the most secure way is the easiest way, human beings will look for a workaround.
Mm.
And oftentimes, we've discovered that when you analyze past incidents, it's actually the human error trying to find workarounds. In the case of manufacturing, if you go to any manufacturing plant in the world, over half the control rooms are going to have like little yellow stickies on top of the computers where
Yeah.
they're accessing that.
Yeah.
That's a problem. And so one of the big things that, again, from Apple was if we can make it simple, great.
Hmm.
So for example, our authentication system was patterned after Apple Pay.
Mhm.
So when you authenticate to a Blast Shield instance, you pull out your phone, you wave it in front of your client, you apply your Face ID, and in 3 seconds, you're in.
Huh.
And it only gives you the permissions that you have been granted, and you can see nothing else
Hmm.
because we cloak your network, we segment your network, and we give you secure remote access all at the same time.
And how did you come up with this, Tom? Like, what was the revelation that was you the were you the one who like started the like in terms of the vision, or was it a technical founder, or what was that like?
Yeah, there were portions. There were portions of it, and I would say it was a shared kind of design in a way.
Hmm.
Um, my technical co-founder ended up leaving the company after about 2 years, which was extremely challenging.
Hmm.
And his name was Blaine Garst, and he'd come up with some concepts around bytecode and some other kind of very clever concepts
Yeah.
that could build what he called unhackable code. Now, I don't believe in an unhackable anything,
Hmm.
but this was what he believed. But unfortunately, his vision, he wasn't able to realize that vision within the constraints we had. So we had to kind of pivot to something that I thought was a little bit more concrete,
Hmm.
a little bit more ready for where the market was, as
Yeah.
opposed to coming up with something kind of that foolproof.
And walk I think that's such a great point, right? And like to know when to pivot as an entrepreneur, right? Like when to like what's your framework? Because I'm curious to get your framework on this, or like how you think through this. Like when do you, because there's like an element of, do I keep pushing through, right? And like keep trying to, fit this, square in a triangle hole, or do I try to
Mhm.
like, or when do I figure out like, okay, when's the right time to pivot? And I feel like that,
Yeah.
is something that's really hard for a lot of entrepreneurs, even really hard for myself, in some cases. Like when did you figure out like, hey, we should pivot?
Yeah, that's a very difficult. It's a great question.
Yeah.
And I would say frame it like as an entrepreneur, you've got to have agility.
Hmm.
You've got to be able to change your mind. You got to be open to new possibilities,
Yeah.
but you also have to have persistence
Yeah.
because you're going to hit so many barriers and you're
Yeah.
going to have to just run through those walls. So
Yeah.
when do you run through the wall and when do you go around it?
Hmm.
And I think it depends on the kind of resistance you're facing.
Mm.
It also depends on what you may be aware of as the factors that could limit your ability to be successful. So let me give you a couple examples.
Hmm.
When we started the company, we actually were a hardware and software solution.
Okay.
So we had two hardware devices that would help accomplish this goal that we wanted in terms of protecting critical infrastructure.
Yeah.
After we got the prototypes put together in early 2020,
Hmm.
everybody probably knows what happened then with the pandemic.
Yeah.
It became clear that people did not want a hardware solution.
Mm.
They wanted to be able to get remote access to their devices. They wanted to be able to load software on any commodity platform. They wanted to have the flexibility to load that in virtual machines, Kubernetes clusters, containers, etc.
Yeah.
When I got the feedback from the customers that this was the case, it wasn't a fundamental challenge to my premise about how security could be done, how you can prevent these um, incidents from occurring. That's a different problem that I was
Yeah.
going to be very persistent about.
Yeah. Yeah.
This
Yeah.
was this was more about the form or the factor that it would take.
Mm.
And so at that point, I'm like, well, I'm not wedded to hardware. In fact, I'd prefer not to. And so then we spent a year basically taking that concept and turning that into a software solution that had four main components to it. But the fundamental first principles about how you prevent cyber attacks is still in place, and I think
Yeah.
it'll be in place 10 years from now.
Yeah. 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 And it's a great point though. Like I think that that's really good advice, because at the end of the day, right, that like the bet that you're making, in terms of like, hey, like that the cybersecurity prevention, like that for sure, right? Like I know that I'm more confident in that than anything. Obviously, the way that you get there and the way that you approach it is, could be malleable in that sense. And the fact that you had the hindsight to listen to your customers, right? Because I think
Mhm.
that's a big part of it, right? Is being able to like
Yeah.
listen to your customers, see what they're saying about what they're using, and then, from there, it's like you're not right. Your customers are right. Like the people who are
Right.
using your product, they know better than you because they're using their product, right? And so like,
And it's almost like if I want to get to Houston from Palo Alto,
yeah,
if there are fires burning down south, I may want to take a different route. So I'm going to be
yeah,
flexible on my route, but I'm
yeah.
still going to Houston.
I love that. I think that's a great point as well. And I think now that I think about it and as we're talking through it, I'm almost coming to some other realization. I think sometimes the bad pivots are when people are like 180 pivots, right? Where they're pivoting too much, right? And it's too much of
Right.
a pivot. But if you pivot almost strategically and what is it you're doing, there's a method to it as well, right? To
Well,
that.
yeah, let me tell you what the bedrock of this is because I think people will understand it too. Because I'm not a software engineer, I'm a chemical engineer.
Yeah.
I'm not as kind of wedded in the right way, quote, to to provide security. So what I started thinking about, starting at first principles, was how do attacks happen?
Hmm.
And is there a common approach or process
Yeah.
that all the hackers use?
Mm.
And from researching that question, oftentimes it's about asking the right question. It's not about having the answers.
Yeah.
So by asking the question, is there a common process that hackers use? I came to the realization, and actually from research, that there was something called the Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain. And I want to make sure they get full credit for this.
Yeah.
But essentially, if you think about it, every hacker starts by doing reconnaissance. Every hacker has to kind of pick a target, figure out what protections are in place,
Yeah.
and then they have to establish a toehold
Hmm.
in the network typically. Sometimes they can establish a toehold by socially engineering somebody.
Yeah.
Sometimes they can exploit a vulnerability or bug.
Mm.
Sometimes they can pay somebody $500,000
Yeah.
who only gets paid 50 grand to the company. So
Mhm.
they've co-opted an insider. But they have to get a toehold inside that
Yeah.
network.
Yeah.
That's step two. Step three, they have to then move laterally and to discover where the crown jewels are.
Mm.
Step four, they have to have a path to deliver a payload to either, in the case of, ransomware, to deploy a payload to that target.
Yeah.
And then they have to create a backdoor command and communication channel so they can control that crown
Mm.
jewel. And so what we did is we designed our solution to thwart every step of that way
Wow.
so that
Uh-huh.
the the number one way, for example, people perform reconnaissance is through network scanning.
Yeah.
Well, the first thing we did is we made sure that anything that was protected by our solution would be unscannable,
Mm.
undiscoverable. It's
Mm.
invisible.
Yeah.
If you can't see it, you can't hack it.
Yeah.
The second thing we did was we looked at how people go after to get that initial toehold. Typically, it's through impersonation through username and password.
Yeah.
Well, what if we get rid of usernames and passwords altogether and we make it more convenient?
Yeah.
So we did that, where the authentication process you can't be tricked into sharing that with somebody else.
Yeah.
And then we also do what's called microsegmentation so that you can't move laterally. Once you do if you were to establish a toehold, you can't move
Yeah.
laterally. And then, in the case of doing the command and control back channel,
Yeah.
we prevent that as well. I'll give you, I won't tell you who the customer was,
Hmm.
but there was a series of cameras
Yeah.
that had been on this site's location for years. And until we deployed Blast Shield, they didn't realize that they were communicating freely with China.
Uh-huh.
Once we deployed Blast Shield, there was no longer a communication path egress
Hmm.
for those cameras to phone home.
Hmm.
So anyway, that's an
That's
example of
fascinating
how,
stuff, man. It really
yeah.
is. It's super. I mean, how people and it's always fascinating to me how we like you said ask the right questions, right, and then that uncovers where you're going to be able to fit your solution in, right? And I think that that's
Right.
I love the way that you've broken that down in that step by step process, and how you've thought through every individual potential opening, right, within a system, right? How
Yeah.
to
Yep.
plug each hole. And so when it comes to like Blastwave, right? Obviously, what you guys are doing now, this is your fourth startup, right? So like
Yep.
you've got some hair on your chest from some of those past ones, right? You've learned some things, right? You've learned some things.
Yeah.
What are some of those things that like you know that have just served you really well in terms of like, hey, this is how we've been able to grow as a company, like either from the marketing
Yeah.
side of things, the sales side of things, like what's been really helpful that you'd be willing to share with the audience?
I think the concepts may not be new. In fact, a
Mhm.
lot of things that we learn aren't necessarily new. We're just relearning them in a different way.
Yeah.
So I think I can't overstate the importance of really trying to serve your customer,
Mm.
obsessing about your customer. And everybody says this,
Yeah.
but what does that mean? We got one customer because they were saying we're just evaluating the vendors based on what their support looks like.
Yeah.
And a lot of folks would have these contracted third-party help desks that they would do to try to save money.
Yeah.
Guess what? It was cheaper. But we chose not to do that. We chose to have our sales engineers and engineering team responsible for supporting customers
Hmm.
24/7. Okay. So when there's a problem, you're going to get Blastwave certified technical support.
Yeah.
You're not going to get handed off to some help desk.
Yeah.
And that responsiveness really matters. The quality of making sure you don't waste your customer's time. How many times are you on a phone tree with a bank or some other service where what they're doing is they're wasting your time because they're not doing a good job of figuring out what you need?
Yeah.
They put the burden on the
All the time.
customer oftentimes.
Yeah.
They now, if you go read their annual report or quarterly report, or you listen to their earnings call, they're going to say, "Oh, customers are really important to us," but their behavior is different. And so
A great
by
point.
not overcharging,
Yeah.
by being disruptive, by really thinking about not just your product, your solution, but thinking about their business and how do we support their business? In our case, how do we keep those production lines running instead of being susceptible to cyber events? We don't have the entire solution, so we work with partners that can provide complementary pieces
Yeah.
delivers the entire solution the customer needs.
Isn't that funny, right? I ask you a question about sales and marketing, and what do you go back to? The product, right? Like, and I
Yeah.
love that. And I love that because I think that that's so, because you can't outsell a shit product. And, I mean, it's just facts, right? It's just, you cannot outsell something that's not going to resonate, and you're prioritizing your customer experience, right? And I think that that's
Yep.
gold right there in terms of how you should think about growth, right? Like because if your product is better, if people have a better customer experience, you're going to get more referrals. You can spend more on your customer acquisition costs, knowing that if you can spend more on the top end, knowing that they're going to refer you to other people, right? You
Yep.
can, you're going to have longer retention, right? So like
Yep.
higher customer LTV, right? So
Mhm.
everything starts with
Lower churn.
lower churn, right? So it's all about that aspect of it. And I love that you put an emphasis on it because it's one of the things that we take really, we obsess over here at our company as well. It's like, how can we improve the customer journey experience? Like, what elements can be better of this, right? And how can you make sure that they always know what's next? They always know this, they always know that, right? And it's like how and it's those types of companies that I've seen that do really well, like that actually perform better than most, because people are always looking at, hey, what is the next thing that I could do to sell, or what's the next thing that I could do, to market, but they're never really thinking about, okay, how can I get my customer to be way like stay, like just want to continue to stay with me and never leave me, right? Like,
Yeah.
how do I become so sticky that they can't even be like, I would never ever leave, Blastway, or would never leave you guys. Like, this is like, we need you guys, to operate our business.
Well, in fact, that kind of leads me to probably the most important thing that any of your audience members could take away from this call are the four things that we deliver for our customers. The first, we actually do prevent accidents, incidents, breaches. We actually stop them.
Yeah.
And that is possible. A lot of people say they can do that, but they can't.
Yeah.
We can do it. We've never been hacked before. And we've had pen testers spend 2 weeks trying to attack us, and they haven't been able to figure out a way to do it.
Yeah.
Now, it's not saying we're unhackable, but we're really hard. And if we're that much harder, people are going to move on to a softer target. So, number one, our stuff actually works.
Yeah.
If people believe that and they believe the other three beliefs, number two, we can deploy in 1/10 the time that it would take to deploy a firewall solution.
Hmm.
Less than that, actually.
Yeah.
We've done it in 4 hours for 100 devices. We've got some places at 20,000 devices we deployed in a series of 2 months.
Yeah.
The third thing is we can do this with half the administrative lift. And
Hmm.
what I mean by that is the amount of time it takes for the customer to spend on deployment and especially on an ongoing basis. We can reduce that time dramatically and that ongoing expense. And the fourth thing, we can do it at about a fourth of the cost. So it works, it's fast, it doesn't take much of your time, and it's cheaper. Why would you ever look at anything else?
Yeah. And I don't know, have you ever read the book, Alex Hormozy, the $100 million offers?
I have read that book, yes.
Okay, because you hit on like every single individual thing that he talks about when it
I
comes
didn't
to,
say guarantee. He talks about guarantees
yeah,
too.
guarantee. Yeah. Obviously, well, you can't guarantee. As a cybersecurity company, or
Yeah,
as a, there's nothing that's guaranteed in that sense, right?
right.
But you talk about the perceived likelihood of achievement, right? The time frame in which it will take,
Dream
right?
outcome,
And the dream outcome, right? Um,
protected.
yeah, exactly. And so it's definitely I love the way that you've talked through that, and I think it's so important, man. It's been a great conversation, Tom. I love your outlook on business and kind of what you guys are building, and it definitely sounds like Blastwave is disrupting, right? It sounds like you
It
guys
is.
I've talked with a lot of cybersecurity companies. One of the first companies that I ever worked with was an MSSP. So I've been in the cybersecurity space. And so I definitely haven't heard the way that you've described things and the way that you've talked with them. It's definitely something that unique that you guys are doing. So before we end here, I always like to end with more of a loaded question.
Okay.
You've done a lot throughout your career, right? You've worked in some different places. You have 4 startups. You played professional poker at one point, right?
Yep. Yep.
Like, what are the most, like what's the most important thing? I know we talked about a couple of things, but what's the most important thing that you've learned throughout your career, that you'd be willing to share with the audience?
What first came to mind is health,
Hmm.
which has nothing to do with business, but it has everything to do with your ability to do everything else in this
Yeah.
world.
Yeah.
I would say the importance of relationships. And what I mean by that is I don't have to worry about my key people leaving my team.
Yeah.
They're on a mission. They're on the exact same mission I'm on from God to solve this problem. And hell or high water, we're going to do it.
Yeah.
I don't worry about my relationship with my kids, my wife, my friends. All of that is like the glue that really helps make business and life meaningful and is important in terms of that trust element that allows people to achieve their potential.
Yeah.
I don't micromanage at all. What that means, though, is I can't afford to hire idiots either.
Yeah.
So I've got to have very high standards for who I hire, and they've got to be on the same mission that we are. And if that's the case, we tell them what the goal is, and we allow them to use their creativity and their own relationships to make it happen.
I love it, man. I think that's the perfect note to end, Tom, on. If people are listening to this, they want to check out you or Blastwave. What are the best ways to go ahead and find you guys?
Blastwave.com. I'm on LinkedIn. I mean, we've got a YouTube channel. So
Perfect. Well, I'll make sure to include those in the descriptions. Make sure to go check out Tom and the team. If you guys did make it all the way to the end, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more content. And we hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Thanks again, Tom.
thanks.